There is something sinister about the coastline of the British Isles, which stretches for some 7,000 miles. It's home to grand hotels and picturesque promenades. On the surface there are bright lights and funfairs, sandy beaches and beautiful sunsets. But dig a little deeper in the sand and you uncover an underworld of murder and mayhem. In Coastal Killers, we take a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea and life meets death. A shoreline that is awash with tales of death and depravity. These are the chilling true stories of Britain's worst coastal killers. In this episode of Coastal Killers, we are in the post-war seaside resort of Bournemouth for the story of a depraved murderer who earned himself the horrific title, the Lady Killer. The Lady Killer in this episode was a man called Neville Heath, one of the most callous murderers Britain has ever produced. His entire life was based on a performance in which he was a dashing leading man who could have any leading lady he wanted. He chose two, but instead of dashing off into the sunset with them, he destroyed them both in the most grotesque manner, firmly demonstrating his own utter depravity as a killer.
But Neville Heath started out as a young man with every opportunity, really. He'd had a good schooling, he came from a good, solid family. He wanted to join the RAF, which he did. And to all intents, he was an excellent pupil. His flight commander had given him an excellent report saying he would make a first-class fighter pilot. But unfortunately, Heath's criminal bent, if you like, took him down another route.
The RAF gave him what he'd always craved, a uniform. Something to make him a cut above the ordinary civilian. He was, if you like, in those early days, something of a peacock. He wanted women to look at him, and he wanted to be charming to them. He had many darker ambitions, but those weren't to come to the surface for some years yet. He was discharged after a year for going absent without leave. And he fell on what might be described as his basic nature, which was to be a bit of a fraudster.
Heath was the sort of man, a gentleman, who you'd see in a London club in those days with a pipe, sitting there reading the Times, chatting to everybody, arms on their backs, cashing cheques which bounced. He would embezzle the mess funds. He would steal anything that wasn't nailed down. He was a crook. He was one of these characters that wants to be somebody but realises he can't be. So he steals, and he's constantly in trouble. He's locked up for this, he's in a magistrate's court for embezzling this, he stole a man's car. He's on the make all the time.
Between July 1938 and September 1939, he even served time in a borstal for fraud, forgery and housebreaking.
Shortly after the RAF, he started, for the first time in his career, adopting false names. Always very grand names. For example, at one point, he christened himself Lord Dudley. It's the first sign that Heath is a man who adopts other identities to conceal his own.
He purported to be Lieutenant Colonel and wore medals that he wasn't entitled to, and it's quite clear that he wanted to be the centre of attention. However, he was a charlatan, a fraudster, but he's also very much a ladies' man.
Neville Heath attracted women because he pretended to be something he wasn't. He knew or sensed what sort of thing a woman would find attractive, and he created himself in that image. He was a fantasist. He created all these alter egos. So he honed to perfection the image of this suave, debonair, glamorous man. Neville Heath had an interesting approach to women. I think he saw them as sexual playthings. He saw men as being better than women, more intelligent than women. I think he used women for his own purposes. He certainly didn't regard them as his equals.
Deep down, he hated women with a passion. He treated them like trash. He once said on the record that all women had the morals of alley cats and they loved rascals like him.
In February 1946, he's discovered in the Strand Palace Hotel in London with a young woman called Pauline Breeze. Pauline is tied to the bed and Heath is attacking her with a whip. Pauline Breeze, who'd clearly agreed to this particular sexual experiment with Heath, is so embarrassed that she doesn't press charges. Neville Heath's career could have been quite different had Pauline actually persisted. In June 1946, Heath checks in to the Pembridge Court Hotel in Notting Hill Gate in London with a young woman called Yvonne Simmons, who he's just met that day. Yvonne is persuaded to spend the night with Heath in the hotel, partly, obviously, for a sexual motive, but also because Heath, who is again pretending to be what he isn't, proposes to her. That was never Heath's real intention. Heath's real intention was to indulge his appetite for sexual adventures with another woman, and he did so very quickly.
As soon as her back was turned, he'd be after somebody else. Easily bored. This was not a man that would end up in an allotment growing roses or playing whist or going to the bowling green. This is a guy that was constantly on the hunt for something better. The grass was always greener. Yes, he probably craved a stable relationship, but you've got a Jekyll and Hyde character here. You've got two entities inside him. You've got the good and you've got the bad fighting, but the bad always won with Heath.
But on the 20th of June 1946, Heath's sadistic sexual tastes took a much more sinister and tragic turn when he met a 32-year-old aspiring actress called Marjorie Gardner in a London bar.
Neville Heath was drawn to women who were vulnerable or who he perceived to be vulnerable, and Marjorie was, again, slightly struggling with her career. She was working in the entertainment business. She would have had a bit of a precarious lifestyle. She'd recently separated, she had a young child. So you can see how she might have been looking for somebody who might offer her a bit of security, offer security for her child. She was in the market for somebody kind of to romanticise her, to sweep her off her feet. Neville Heath recognised that and tried to do so.
You can imagine how attractive Heath would have seemed. He would have told Marjorie about his war exploits, of course, embellishing them dramatically to make him seem even more exciting. And indeed, he checked in to the Pembridge Court Hotel, calling himself Lieutenant Colonel Heath.
Like thousands of others in London after the war, she was out to have fun and she met Heath, but she had rather strange sexual tastes. She liked a little bit of whipping and a bit of bondage and a bit of tying up. And of course, Heath loved it. That was it. And so this was like the hand grenade. You got the bomb and you got the pin. They're inert, separated, but you put them together and you can get an explosion. And that's exactly what happened with Heath and Marjorie Gardner.
Marjorie goes back with Heath to the Pembridge Court Hotel. They arrive there at around midnight. What happens next is utterly terrifying and reveals exactly how much of a monster Neville Heath truly was. For Marjorie Gardner is subjected to the most dramatic abuse imaginable.
I cannot say how awful the injuries to Marjorie were. They were shocking. It is almost indescribable, the suffering that this girl had gone through at this man's hands.
She is bound. Her wrists are tied behind her back. Now, I suspect, although no one can be absolutely sure, that she may have agreed to part of this. Perhaps Heath persuaded her it was some kind of game, a sex game of some kind. What she couldn't have known is that Heath was then literally to take her life.
Neville Heath had charmed Marjorie Gardner and taken her back to his room at the Pembridge Court Hotel. She had no idea of the terrible danger she was now in.
He beat her 17 times with a very specific kind of riding whip, leaving grotesque marks on her body. He bit her nipples severely. He, and it pains me to say this, also thrust something inside her, possibly a poker.
He actually cruelly rotated it while she was still alive. And to me, it mirrors Peter Sutcliffe, where Peter Sutcliffe was stabbing and mutilating his victim with a Phillips screwdriver, which was an extension of his manhood. And I see the same trait with Neville Heath.
And then, as if to add insult to the utter injury, he suffocated the girl.
The level of injuries that Marjorie received are, even to modern eyes, shocking. Neville Heath was clearly a sadist. He was inflicting pain while she was alive because he got off on it. Almost the death is an incidental part of it. He has to kill her because he's had his pleasure and he doesn't want her telling anyone about it. But I think for him, the primary hit is to inflict that pain while she's alive.
I think the injuries he inflicted on her says a lot about him and how he saw women. He treated her as if she was just a piece of meat or an animal. There was no affection there. There was just purely get rid of his frustration, his anger. The fact that he tried to bite a nipple off, again, suggests he has no respect for her. A lot of anger towards women.
I think she was probably flattered by his attention, that she might have been willing to have sex with him. But I think at some point, at some stage, when she realised what he really wanted to do, she would have panicked and said, "No, I don't want to do this."
Heath didn't blink an eye. He simply left the Pembridge Court Hotel at about, we think, 1:30 in the morning after having killed Marjorie. Her body wasn't discovered until the following morning, long after he was gone. A chambermaid had gone in, an assistant manager was summoned, the lights and curtains were opened, and Marjorie's mutilated body is covered with a blood-stained sheet. Just imagine for a moment what it must have been like to turn back that sheet and see what had happened to this poor and utterly innocent 32-year-old. She'd fallen into the hands of a man who can only be called a sexual monster. but a monster hiding in the most respectable clothing.
A good question would be, was this a premeditated murder? Absolutely not. What we're talking about is a sexual psychopath, fueled with drink, when he explodes in a rage. There was no planning. He didn't take her there with the intent to kill her and then leave her in the hotel and go. It happened. And that is the danger of these people. And I have told people thousands of times, you will never know a serial killer or a killer's going to hit you until it's too late.
The hotel immediately alerted the police, and they came along with the photographer and a pathologist who immediately recorded the injuries to Marjorie Gardner, which included distinctive criss-cross patterns on her back, which had been made by a whip. The pathologist apparently said, if you find the whip, you found your man.
As the police began their investigation into the brutal murder of Marjorie Gardner, Heath didn't look back. He instead turned his attention to the woman he had met just a few nights earlier.
Apparently unmoved by the horrors that he'd inflicted on the innocent Marjorie Gardner, Heath gets a train to Worthing to visit Yvonne Simmons, whom he's proposed to earlier in the week.
One of the interesting facets of Heath's character was his ability to tell stories and embellish facts. And he'd had a relationship with Yvonne previously, and she'd said that he was a gentleman and he'd only ever treated her very gently, although he'd slept with her. There was no sign of any of the sadomasochism that he exhibited later.
You do wonder what she had that Neville was so attracted to that he let her live, because I think he could have killed her very easily if he'd wanted to. But he dated her, he spent a night with her, and I wonder whether he was genuinely attracted to this woman and whether he thought this could be a genuine relationship, or whether he was playing a bit more of a cat and mouse thing with her, whether he was kind of saving her for later.
To my view, Heath had pre-selected Yvonne to be the victim. For some reason, Marjorie Gardner seemed to be an easier target, someone who had fallen on hard times, was more consistent with allowing herself to be tied up and indulging in his fantasy play, whereas he saw Yvonne as a young straight woman, innocent because he actually took her virginity.
This was not a commonplace crime in 1946. Not surprisingly, this dreadful attack attracted enormous amount of publicity. Suddenly, Heath's name is public knowledge. There are even pictures of Heath.
Heath needed to act fast to cover his tracks and gave himself an alibi for the murder of Marjorie Gardner.
Heath invented this story whereby she had said to him that she was meeting a man, and if Heath came back to the hotel later, then he could use the room. So he invented all these facts around the fact that he was the murderer.
He wrote a letter to the officer in charge of the homicide in London, Marjorie Gardner, a lengthy, drivelling letter, saying that he thinks he knows who killed Marjorie. She wanted to use his hotel room because she had a friend who wanted to have sex with him, again starting to paint her in a black light. In other words, he's shifting the blame. He's trying to pass away the blame.
Aware that the police were now on his trail, Heath decided to move on. He left Yvonne and headed for the bustling seaside town of Bournemouth, with its grand hotels and vibrant holiday atmosphere. But he had no intention of skulking away, and he made a remarkable decision. he decided to hide in plain sight, reinventing himself in an audacious new guise.
Where he booked into the Tollard Royal Hotel under the name Group Captain Rupert Brooke. So he'd assumed, again, this very grandiose title, but not only that, so he'd used the name of a famous World War I poet as well, which has often baffled historians and writers who've looked into the case as to why he would potentially draw attention to himself with this name.
I'm fascinated by the title. To call himself group captain, obviously that's a military thing, but Rupert Brooke, who was probably one of the most famous wartime poets and a great romantic, and he is using that title, I think, because that's the image he wants to portray of himself, the great lover, the great romantic, the nice guy. And that's totally in conflict with what he actually ends up doing to his victims.
We next find Heath at the upper-class Tollard Royal Hotel in Bournemouth. This is overlooking the sea, beautiful building. It was state-of-the-art in its day, had a lift as well, and the sun came through all the right windows, and it was plush. Heath booked in, and he started hobnobbing with people at the bar, regaling them with his stories, but he had no money. I mean, this is just amazing character. This actor, this homicidal actor, standing there telling everybody, oh, yes, I flew in South Africa, you know, I had a wonderful time there. Married to so-and-so and so-and-so, yes, you know, several awards. Of course, everybody loved it. This is an officer and a gentleman, a war hero standing amongst them all. They're all buying him drinks and meals. He didn't have a penny in his pocket.
He commits a murder, quite a horrific murder, and then carries on this lifestyle of a very kind of high-flying individual. I think that's simply because he's been so successful at doing that. When he was in the RAF, he got into trouble, he got kicked out of the RAF. So he did get the military rank, and he just seems to be one of these people that's very successful and keeps falling on his feet when he's committed crime. So he carries on, and he thinks he's invincible.
It was almost as if the murder of Marjorie Gardner hadn't happened.
It was there in the joyful seaside resort that Heath struck again. Just days after the life of Marjorie Gardner had been taken, another woman was about to fall prey to the sadistic killer. This time his target was a 19-year-old Air Force Wren, Doreen Marshall, whose life was about to be brutally cut short. Neville Heath had already committed one horrific murder, but rather than going to ground, he made his way to the fashionable seaside resort of Bournemouth, intent on killing once again.
One afternoon when he was out for a walk along the top of the cliffs there, he met two wrens, and one of them was Doreen Marshall, who was down in Bournemouth recuperating because she had a bad cold. Her father had sent her to another hotel, and they met.
Doreen Marshall appears at first sight to be very different to Marjorie Gardner. She's a good decade younger, she's more innocent. But if you think about it, Neville Heath was drawn to vulnerability. He targeted vulnerable women, and vulnerability could be expressed in different ways. So Marjorie was vulnerable because of her career, because of her marital status, because she was a mother. Doreen, although she was none of those things, she had been ill, she was very young, she was away from home, she was recuperating in a town where she didn't know anybody. So she was ripe, really, for him to target.
Ever the lizard looking after his prey. Heath invites her to afternoon tea in the hotel. Well, very grand hotels, wonderful plates of cakes and perfectly served, silver teapots, elegant china, waitresses in immaculate uniforms. Doreen must have been thrilled.
I don't think it was she had anything romantic ideas in her head at all. It was just a casual affair. But she was honoured. She was so thrilled. There was a colonel taking a young wren out.
Doreen Marshall went willingly with Heath for afternoon tea and then later for dinner. And all the subsequent reports from the staff, from the guests, all say that she was there, to all intents, enjoying the meal with Heath, who was drinking a lot. He ordered champagne. But at some point during the course of that evening, the mood began to change.
Something makes Doreen Marshall nervous, uneasy.
I'm of the mind that at some point he was either controlling or he said something about his life where she thought, hang on, 2 and 2 don't make 4 here. I'm not sure he's the person he's purporting to be. I think that's more realistically a reason why she became uncomfortable.
She asks the hotel to call her a taxi to take her back to our own hotel, the Norfolk. This clearly was not in Heath's plan. The slightly darker side of Neville Heath then reveals itself to Doreen.
Heath said, cancel that taxi. I'm taking this young lady home. And she protested, but he insisted.
I think he was probably annoyed by her rejection. Having been very keen on him during the evening, there came a point where she was uncomfortable and she wanted a taxi, and he said, no, I'll cancel the taxi, I'll walk you back. I suspect he tried it on again then, and she rejected him.
He says he'll be half an hour with her, walking her home and back. She then turns around and says, no, he'll be quarter of an hour, which is a key sign that she really doesn't want to spend any more time with him than she has to now. She's had enough, she wants to go home. As far as she's concerned, he can walk her home and go, that's it.
Doreen Marshall is never seen alive again. A day and a half pass. Doreen Marshall is reported missing. The manager of the Tollard Royal knows that the person that Doreen was dining with that night was, of course, Group Captain Rupert Brooke.
The managers actually talked to each other because they knew that she'd had dinner in one hotel and was staying in another hotel. So again, it's easy for the police to put him in the frame, because he put himself in the frame.
Heath denied that the lady that he'd had a meal with was the lady in question who was missing initially. He then admitted that he'd had dinner with her and had walked her to the hotel. But this led eventually with him being asked to speak to the police by the manager of the Tollard Royal.
Convinced he was untouchable, Heath, under his new guise of Group Captain Brooke, agreed to go to Bournemouth police station to explain his side of the story.
He talks to a detective constable, Souter, and tells him the same story that he'd told the manager of the Tollard Royal. The last time he'd seen Doreen Marshall was in the gardens in central Bournemouth, and he never saw her again.
Heath, when he went to the police station, he thought he was so clever and above the plods that he could talk his way out of anything. He had this persona that serial killers have, that they are in complete control of the circumstances they find themselves in.
By some extraordinary coincidence, Doreen's father and sister have arrived in Bournemouth, worried about the disappearance of Doreen.
As he was leaving, Doreen Marshall's father walked in with Doreen's sister, who was almost identical to look at. Heath froze, as if she'd come back from the dead. And the officer noticed it.
The excellent detective constable Souter looks at him and remembers the wanted poster that has been sent to Bournemouth for the man that killed Marjorie Gardner in the Pembridge Court Hotel in London. And he utters the most telling phrase of this entire dreadful story. He says to Group Captain Brooke, "Isn't your name Heath?"
Everyone asks, why did he walk into the police station and give himself up? Well, he didn't actually walk in to give himself up, but there's an argument that he decided he would walk in because it appealed to the risk-taking in him, and that fits with a lot of psychopathic behaviour. The more the risk, the better it is for them, the more excitement that they feel. But as soon as he walked into the police station, events conspired to prove that he was actually Neville Heath and not Group Captain Rupert Brooke.
It's clear that the good detective constable has got a very firm suspicion that he is in fact Neville Heath. And Heath says, "I've got to go back to the Tollard Royal Hotel and collect my jacket." No, the police are not going to allow that to happen. No, Group Captain, you stay here. We'll fetch your jacket for you.
So one of the policemen went to the hotel to pick the jacket up. Unbeknown to Heath, who'd obviously forgotten, there was evidence in the pocket of the jacket which the policeman then found, linking him not only to the murder of Doreen Marshall, but also to the murder of Marjorie Gardner. The policeman found a railway ticket, storage ticket. So the policeman went to Bournemouth train station and picked up the luggage that Heath had left, which was a suitcase.
Inside the suitcase, they discover, among other things, a very distinctive riding whip. The riding whip that Heath had used to kill Marjorie Gardner. They also discover in the suitcase a handkerchief with human hair tied in it. And in the pocket of Heath's jacket, they also find one pearl.
It would be just a few days later that the true significance of that pearl would become chillingly clear.
On Sunday, the 7th of July, a young waitress walking her dog in Bournemouth is attracted to a rhododendron thicket by a swarm of flies.
She found what looked like a woman's body. It was the stinking remains of Doreen Marshall. She had been bitten. Clothes had been torn off, scattered around. Pearl necklace had been thrown away, scattered beads everywhere.
She's also been brutally mutilated, once again showing signs of having been bound, once again having been beaten, once again having her nipples bitten, once again having an object inserted into her, and this time, additionally, the most savage wound from the inner thigh up to her mutilated breast. This is the work of a depraved monster, and that monster is actually in Bournemouth Police Station. In my own mind, I've always believed that in a sense, Heath, by this point, was literally out of control, that he would do whatever it took, he would kill whomever he wanted to, in the sole pursuit of an extraordinary sexual sadism. He was, in every real sense, a psychopath and a sexual sadist.
I've seen pictures of the actual murder site, which was Branksome Dean Chine, where there was no promenade and it was just a very narrow strip of beach. So even today, if you visit that site at night, or sometimes even in the daytime, you can see how desolate that would have been. So if you imagine that Heath has managed to walk with Doreen all that way, and there's been many comments made as to why she actually went that distance with him when her hotel was completely the opposite direction. And there's all sorts of ideas been put about that, one of them being that Heath would have charmed her and would have perhaps offered marriage, engagement, which was one of the ruses that he used to seduce women. So, but whatever happened, he managed to get her all the way from Bournemouth to Branksome Dean Chine, where he then murdered her, I believe, about 80 yards from the beach.
I think Doreen's murder was definitely premeditated. By this point, Neville Heath has already committed murder. He's found it relatively easy, therefore why wouldn't you do it again? I think as soon as he saw her for the first time, he saw her as a victim and he knew what he was going to do to her.
Lots of killers take souvenirs, and he clearly took a pearl from her pearl necklace as a souvenir. There's no other explanation, really. He's kept it to remind him of the experience he enjoyed with her. And that would be like you and I going on holiday and bringing back a souvenir from a foreign country. He's got a souvenir to remind him of what he did to this poor victim. And we know that killers often keep souvenirs. It could be clothing, it could be hair, it could be teeth, or it could be jewellery, or a whole mixture of things like that.
You also sense that he's almost giving himself rewards. You know, he's killed this woman and he's taking something to reward himself. He's proud of what he's done. He thinks this is an achievement.
By now, it is perfectly obvious that Group Captain Brooke cannot sustain the fantasy any longer. Addy confesses that he is indeed Neville Heath, just as the good Detective Constable Souter had always suspected. And on the 8th of July, 1946, he is returned to London to be charged with the murder of Marjorie Gardner. In spite of the fact that Heath had slashed poor Doreen Marshall's throat as well as mutilating her body, he is not tried for her murder, because at that point in British law, you were only tried for one murder, which only underlines how rare serial killers were. Originally, Heath, demonstrating the insouciance that he liked to show, particularly to impressionable young ladies, told his defence counsel, "Oh, I'll plead guilty, old boy." And the counsel said, "I don't think so," and suggested it would be much better if he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Two prison psychiatrists contradict the defence and say, no, Neville Heath is a psychopath and a sexual sadist. Absolutely correct. It takes the jury no time whatever to convict Neville Heath of the murder of Marjorie Gardner. Heath at that point was only 29 years old. He showed not a flicker of remorse to his victims.
The interesting thing about Neville is that he was a mummy's boy, or rather he claimed to be a mummy's boy, but it's not certain whether he was really honest about his feelings or whether he was actually manipulating his mother again to create a good image of himself. He certainly wanted to present himself as this poor son who's hard done by, who misses everybody. So in 1946 he wrote to his mother while he was awaiting execution and said, "My dear mother, I cannot express how I feel about the sorrow and misery which I must have caused you all." And he presents himself very much as being concerned about her. It's not about him, it's about her. What has he done to her? He's so upset about the misery he's caused her. But to be cynical, I don't think he means this. He's trying to manipulate people and situations to present himself in the best possible light.
On the day of the hanging, the executioner arrived early. They measured the drop. They weighted a sandbag on the rope to stretch the hempen rope. In a cell literally adjacent to where Heath is, the death cell, is 7 steps, 8 steps. At the hour when the bell tolled, he was pinioned, hooded, and dropped to his death. I like Neville Heath for all of the wrong reasons. He's a charlatan, he's a con man. He is a man that wears many, many masks. He is like a homicidal actor, a man that can dress up as one person, walk off stage, and come back 10 minutes later, a completely different character, and able to convince his audience, or the people around him, that he is as he is. In other words, he is like many psychopaths. They wear different masks, and you peel each mask away and something else comes out, another entity comes out.
Clearly, this is a man who enjoyed killing, enjoyed the violence he inflicted on his victims. We saw no evidence at all of any genuine remorse, and I think it's quite likely that he would have carried on killing until he eventually got caught. There was nothing stopping him. He was successful, albeit very short-term success, but he was successful in what he was doing, clearly enjoyed what he was doing. He was going to carry on doing that for as long as he could. And although 2 women died, I think we were lucky that there was only 2. It could have easily been a lot more.
Heath clearly had a split personality. There was the nice guy who he portrayed to all and sundry, and then on a one-to-one basis where he was alone with a victim, then he inflicted the most evil deeds upon that person. Where that came from, whether he was born to kill or whether it happened through his childhood and developed, that's a question unanswered.
He had this charisma and the flamboyance. He was like a James Bond figure, if you like. So it's not hard to imagine him as a movie star.
The title Lady Killer really bestows some glamour on him. It makes him sound exciting. It sounds like the movie, doesn't it? It gives him that cinematic glamour. But in the same process, it depersonalises his victims. It takes their identities away and their names.
Heath was the most dangerous of killers. There were no horns, there was no tail. He didn't wear a black cloak. Instead, he wore a uniform and medals that he didn't deserve. He was a man who, if you met in the corner of the saloon bar of your local pub, you would see as being nothing but upright.
It could be the boys living next door to you, who's charming and nice. It could be the man sitting behind you on the bus, or the man that looks twice at you in the supermarket while you're shopping for a coat. You'd never realise that the person's a killer until they strike. That killer might have been following you for days and weeks, stalking you. But sometimes they just come out of the blue.
To the very end, Neville Heath displayed no remorse or guilt for his victims. As far as he was concerned, they were mere objects for his sexual domination. The only tears he ever shed were in a letter to his parents at the very end of his life, in which he wrote, "My only regret at leaving the world is that I have been deemed unworthy of you both." Heath's depravity knew no bounds and was only matched by his hypocrisy.